And Dr. Janet Shideler from Siena College is here with us now. Welcome. We appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. You teach French language and literature, but you also specialize in French-Canadian culture and history. So the goal of this project is to document and to help preserve this period of American history when well over 1 million French Canadians crossed the border and worked in the textile mills and farmed and worked in the mines.
Mining, lumber camps as well of upstate New York, exactly. Our focus is primarily upstate New York. Now, as you well know, there was movement back and forth over the border, but we're looking at Cohoes and north, and so our next exploration is into the North Country.
And we're talking about a period, what, mid-1800s?
Mid-1800s. There were some who came earlier, given land tracts. We have records that there were French-Canadian families in Cohoes as early as the 1830s, but it was primarily 1840s, the 1860s with the Civil War and the departure of men for war. There was a need for manpower in the textile mills, and so that's when you find a more massive immigration.
They worked primarily in the textile mills in Cohoes.
Precisely. But you know, it's always a little bit misleading. At Harmony Mills, the textile mills, of course, were most prominent as a major employer, but virtually every socioeconomic class came. People saw opportunity. They saw the chance to, I'm a physician, why don't I go serve French Canadians in this burgeoning community? I'm a dentist, I'd like to open a shop, I'm a journalist. And so you found virtually every social class represented.
The French Canadians were the largest ethnic group in Cohoes for a number of decades?
Yes, yes. And of course, Troy, right across the river, they worked in mills there as well. Waterford, that entire area, as you know, is a hub of industrial activity. And yes, they came as, frankly, cheap labor.
And they worked also in mills in Vermont, we know, in the rest of New England, in Massachusetts. In Clinton County, primarily as farmers, they crossed the border to farm?
Yes. Part of the richness of the New York story is that it was very diversified. So besides different socioeconomic classes, you had people in industry, but you also had farmers. You also had people working in the lumbering camps, the shanties. And then you also had people mining. So and virtually every community.
What was it that drove them across the border? Were they fleeing from tough times and just seeing a better opportunity and employment across the border in the United States?
It's sort of a combination of both. The soil, because remember that French Canadians were primarily farmers, and they were told very strictly by leadership that that was their vocation. Their divine vocation was to be farmers. And so here are people who have been on the same land that was tilled generation after generation, soil depleted, and so farms were not producing particularly well. And so they, part of it was word would come back to them in their villages about the success of one family member or a couple of friends. Some of the, in particular in the textile industry, they actually recruited. They would send flyers back in French and in English to say, come, there's opportunity. And so there was an economic reason for doing so, and there was the lure of the success of those whom they knew were doing better. Doing better doesn't mean that they were affluent by any means, but they at least had a guaranteed salary, which was something that they didn't have in a more precarious agricultural vocation.
And as you mentioned, word got out, relatives would come. They built beautiful, elaborate churches. They had their own cultural centers that they would frequent?
Right. The mutual aid societies, the Société Saint-Jean-Baptiste.
But on the flip side, they also would face some discrimination. Was that primarily because of speaking French?
It was a combination of language and religion. Language certainly was a barrier to them. And remember that they held on to that. That was something for them that was that identified them. That was part of their sense of who they were as a people. So it was certainly that, and it was also religion. French Canadians at the time were ultra-conservative Roman Catholics, and so there was a tremendous amount of pushback and discrimination against them. But certainly language made them stand out. They were not easily assimilated.
And they would speak their native tongue in the homes.
Definitely.
But did they, because of that discrimination, did they not speak it as often outside the home? And as each generation went on, did they speak it less and less? Because the generations of today, many of them are not fluent in French.
Right. Part of it depended on the community. Part of it depended on family. Just as immigrants now say, and now we want to succeed, and so we're going to speak the language of the majority. There were some who made that decision. I've had some of the people we've interviewed have said it was strictly forbidden to speak French in our household. But we've also had people who say, my grandmother lived with us. There were 3 generations, and so she didn't speak English. She insisted that we maintain the language. And also up until the 1940s and 50s, most Franco-Americans, at least in urban areas like Cahos, would have been educated in French and English. They would have also learned Canadian history, Canadian geography. So they always had sort of that one foot still in the culture and the language of their homeland.
And so tell us about the project that you're doing now. How did you get the idea to do this? You've studied this for a number of years, but you, in the piece we just saw, you shared the story about how you were actually working as a tour guide and you were taking people to Canada on tours, and you noticed that a lot of them were people living in the States.
Yes.
Their families had lived in the States for years, returning to their homeland.
Right. And for many of them, it was, in a sense, a pilgrimage. And sometimes it was. This one particular group where I said, I have to do this. I was taking them to Saint-Anne-de-Beaupré, the shrine just outside of Quebec City. And literally every name of every passenger on that bus, all 42 of them, the name was French Canadian. Colchen, Beauchemin, Rivard, and it was Monsieur Rivard who was seated right beside me, who he could see that I was puzzled by this. And without dating myself, I'll tell you, this was a few decades ago when there really no one was studying Franco-Americans. So 1 million people leave and no one talks about their fate. And so Monsieur Rivard looked at me and he said, you know, someone has to tell our story. And I said, I promise. And so this project, leap forward all of these years, this project is really not so much about me telling the story, but allowing them, enabling them to tell their story. And to do that with artifacts as well. Now, most of the artifacts, as you've seen by visiting the website, most of those artifacts are photographs. And if photos can tell a story of 1,000 words, then imagine how many stories we're able to convey with 198 artifacts to date. But we also have furniture. We've taken photos of furniture that was in the first homes of Franco-Americans. We've had doilies. We've had, you name it, a rich variety of items.
And also oral histories, learning what era the families crossed the border, where they worked.
Right. Now, so we've recorded that as part of the metadata. What we haven't done is the actual recording of people speaking, and that we hope for a step 2. We'd like to expand and record people actually speaking to us and share that on a website as well.
And so in this day and age, you're creating an archive that is going to be online.
Precisely. All of these artifacts are now publicly available through New York Heritage digital collections. So people can go to nyheritage.org and look for Siena College, and among Siena's collections you'll find Je Me Souviens, I remember. That's the name of our particular project. We also have a tiny URL that includes NEH/Franco, but it's fairly easy to find, we hope.
Many of the artifacts collected so far are from the Cahos area.
Yes.
And you had a gathering this past summer where folks brought these artifacts, and then you had another gathering in October at Siena College where you sort of celebrated this
Right.
project kicking off and these artifacts being cataloged. And you brought together a number of the families, the descendants of
Yes.
these families to celebrate the project.
Indeed,
really.
indeed. And it was a celebration. We had a wonderful turnout, and we unveiled the collection to date.
So in this day and age, you actually go out in the field. You came to a home up here in the North Country
Yes.
in Shazy, New York, Rick Lauren and Priscilla Lauren's
Yes.
home. And a number of people, many of them relatives of the Laurens, came over and brought their artifacts, their old photographs and everything with them. And that was quite an afternoon
It was
where
a-
you were able to catalog all this. Rick and Priscilla made all kinds of French Canadian cuisine that
Absolutely.
the house just
Yes.
smelled wonderful.
Yes, and I think for my students that was really an extraordinary event. Not just because the food was outstanding, but I think because they saw people still living these traditions, and that this isn't just something that we historically place in an archive and then walk away from it. That these people are still experiencing their heritage.
And you're doing more of this. You're planning more of these trips to the North Country later this year.
Yes, yes. So this initial grant runs out at the end of June 2019. So we are going to be, as soon as commencement is over with at Siena, we're going to hit the road and come straight up 87 and start visiting various communities and French villages in the communities.
And much the same gatherings where folks will be encouraged to bring their oral histories, bring their artifacts, their photographs, and share them.
Exactly.